Hello, welcome to another Clevetech Tech Tips video. You may have seen in my previous video I was preparing some gears. Well, in today's video we're going to be gluing that gear onto an axle. Now, why do we want to glue gears on? Well, we want the gear to run nice and true on the axle, not be distorting the axle due to tightening the grub screw. We can also reduce the mass of the boss on the gear and lighten the whole thing up so it spins faster, improves your brakes, and generally makes your slot car go faster. So you can see I've got a range of tools ready for the job. There are a couple more, but they're only standard things you're likely to have as a slot racer anyway. So I've got this is a key ingredient, Yoo-hoo glue. Again, I'll put a link in the description below the video where you can get this type of glue. I've found it works brilliantly for gears. I also use it for lots of other things as well, of which you'll see some more tech videos in the future. I've got a little 2.5 M2.5 tap. Again, what am I going to use that for? Why do I need that to glue gears on? Well, you'll see later on. I've got an old 24th scale hub, a very narrow cut-off disc. Again, links for a lot of these tools will be in the description below. Got my axle, got my gear, which you've probably seen me prepare in an earlier video. I'll put a link on the screen of that earlier video. I've got a pair of S&K offset hubs. These are brilliant hubs. They're 2mm for 30-second cars, and they are probably the best hubs you can get at the moment. I've got my tyre Allen key, I've got a little bit of bent piano wire here, and I've got my axle checker. Again, I used to make some axle checkers. I haven't got round to making any more, but it is my plan to make some Clevetech axle checkers and pinion checkers all in one. So keep tuned for that in a future video. Also on the side here, I've got my little jig just for holding my axles with the gears on when I've glued them, when I'm going to put them in the oven to cure the glue. We're going to start with our axle and preparing our axle. Now, this is a Cahoza 2mm axle. Now, I've cut it to pretty much 49mm. There we go, 49mm. Now, that's important. And I'll show you how I managed to achieve that 49mm length and why that's important. Well, when you take your hubs that you're going to use for your car, it's achieved by putting the axle into your hub and noticing how the axle can come through the middle of the hub, like that. Well, if the axle was to just stick through the middle of the hub, and the other hub also goes onto the end of your axle, and again just wants to stick through. So you don't want excess length of axle on your car, because obviously that's extra weight, extra rotating mass that you don't need. So you need the axle just about long enough. Now, if you were to set your calipers to the width that you're allowed in the rules, so let's say 64mm for a 30-second car, something around that value, and you open your hubs out to that width, like that, then clearly you would want your axles to just be in the right place in your hub. So to find that distance out, let's measure the depth of the hub on one side, which comes out at 6mm. The depth of the hub on the other side, which comes out, well, 9.81. Which means that we then cut it down to 49. So 49 plus 15 is your 64mm. Hence that's why 49 is a very important length. That length may very well vary if you're going to use different hubs to these, so you would have to measure your own hubs, I mean, these are offset hubs. If you weren't going to use offset hubs and you're going to turn the boss all the way off your gear, you could go for an even shorter axle, but then you end up with less gluing area on your gear, especially on a 2mm gear. Again, you know, different makes of hubs have different thicknesses of boss, so you may want to measure your hubs, do that calculation that I put on the screen, and work out your own optimum length of axle for your 32nd car. You can do the same in 24th as well. Having cut my axle to the right length, I'm just going to make sure that my axle is actually still nice and true. So I'm going to put it in my axle checker, hold it in place, and rotate the axle. And you can see that as I'm rotating it, there is virtually no movement at all on the dial, which is good. Try the other end, flip it over, see what we get on the other end. Oh, holding it in place. There we go, rotate. Again, hardly anything, a lot less than a 100th of a millimetre. Yeah. If it was moving perhaps more than 200ths, it would be too bent. I probably wouldn't use that axle. But you can check all your axles from the start anyway. So after we've checked our axles for straightness, we now need to work out where the gear is going to go on the axle, because we're going to roughen up the axle a little bit, or put some little nicks in the axle to help the glue key to the axle a little bit. So how do we work out where the gear is going on our axle? Well, on the gear side, we use the offset hub. So the width of the offset hub is nearly 16mm. I think this is a slightly used one. 16mm. Remember, we've got the recess there, which is 6mm. So we're now down to 10mm. The recess at the back is 3.5mm. So that's 10, 9, 8, 7, 6.5mm. So we know that the boss in the middle of the wheel is 6.5mm. Now, if I set my calipers to 6.5mm, I'm actually going to set it to 7.5mm, because when the hub goes onto the axle, I've got slightly rounded ends to my axle. So I want to make sure that the hub of the gear, or the boss inside the wheel, sits nicely on the full part of the axle and doesn't actually sit on a rounded bit at the end. So I've added an extra mil onto that. So we're talking 7.5mm. That basically is how much is going to stick out of our axle at the end for our wheel to go onto. So at 7.5mm, I'm just going to make a mark with a pen on my axle, 7.5mm, and it's not that crucial. This is only literally to mark the space where the gear is going to be. I'll show you how you can locate the gear accurately in a minute. This is only literally to mark where we're going to roughen up our axle. So we don't want any roughening up marks beyond that point on the axle. Then we can take our gear. Now the boss on our gear is again a further 6.5, just over 6.5mm, a little bit more. So if I take a further 6.5mm from where we were before, so roughly around about 14mm. Again, make a mark. So that's where the boss of the gear is likely to sit on my axle. At this point, it's always worth doing a check to make sure that that is actually in the right place. So when you put your markings on your axle, this is especially important if this is the first one you've done, slide your gear onto the axle and line it up in between your marks here. Take a chassis like the one you're going to be using, put your axle into the bearings, push it through, there we go. Get your axle where it should be. Just check how much is sticking out each side. Take your hubs, slide your hub on to roughly where it's going to be sitting on your axle. Slide the other hub on, like so, and then just check where the axle comes to inside the hub. Again, check it that side. Yes, all looking good. It sticks nicely through the hubs. It's not too far inside the hubs. It's about right where it should be. So therefore I know I've got my spacing correct. This is one of my 32nd saloon chassis, which I shall be using in our national championships. Probably by the time this video comes out, I will have used it, so hopefully I'll have some success. Now that I know that my axle is marked in the right place, because I've just checked it on my car, you could probably at this stage line up other axles with it and mark all your axles at the same time. That's what I've done. So now I need to put some little roughening marks, some little nicks around the axle, just to help the glue key to the axle slightly. Don't want to make these too big because I don't want to weaken the structure of the axle too much, but I do just want to roughen up the axle a little bit. So this is where I'm going to use my ultra thin disc, just to put a couple of little tiny marks and cuts in the axle around its diameter. So I'm going to start, just lay that out because I don't want dust everywhere, and I'm going to go at a slight angle on my axle. 1, 2, 3. There we go. I don't know whether you can see that. I'll bring it close to the camera. You can see I've put some little marks around the axle. That'll just help the glue key to the axle. Not gone very deep, just enough just to roughen that axle up around where the gear is going to be going. So now that I've roughened up my axle, I need to do the same for the gear. So here is a gear that I prepared in my previous video, and this is where I use my M2.5 tap. So it's actually a taper tap. I know some other people that use different sizes of tap. You can maybe go for a slightly smaller tap, maybe an imperial size, something like that. But this works fine for both 332 axles and 2mm axles, or 2mm gears and 332 gears, depending on how far through the gear you go. So for a 332 axle, or a gear with a 332 hole, I use my M2.5 and I go virtually all the way through the gear. Because this is a taper tap, again, I don't go all the way through the gear for my 2mm. So I start at the boss end. The reason why I'm starting at the boss end is because where the gear is, I don't want to disrupt this surface inside the gear where the actual gear part is running on the axle, because I want it to run as true as possible. But I'm roughening up the inside, or basically putting slots all the way around the inside of the boss to allow the glue to spread out around the inside of the boss, so that when I push the gear onto the axle, I don't push all the glue away and there's still glue inside holding it in place. So not only do I have a bond of the glue, I also have a mechanical bond in the roughness of the axle and the slots and the grooves inside the gear. So put that through my gear. I just put something down on my block because I don't want aluminium shards everywhere. So I start there and I run it just by hand. Again, the tap will sort of true itself out through the gear, and as I'm not going all the way through, if I'm slightly off, it's not going to matter. The gear should still sit nicely on the axle. But I'm going to head through, keep tapping that, go back a little bit just to clear out the threads. I'm just threading that onto the gear like that, back a bit, going through again. And I tend to go through with this tap just so that when you're looking at the end of the gear, you can just see perhaps that the threads haven't quite got all the way to the end. I'll put a close-up shot of that up on the screen in a moment. So when the gear is tapped, it's always worth making sure it actually pushes onto the axle okay and sits nicely on the axle and doesn't wobble around. This one does. Sometimes when you're tapping the inside of the gear, obviously it roughens up the inside of the gear and it can be a really tight fit on the axle. If it's a really tight fit on the axle, when you come to push it on with the glue, it can sometimes be really hard to get it onto the axle. So I always make sure that the gear fits onto the axle first. So the next job now is to clean everything up really thoroughly. So we make sure that the gear is clean and the axle is clean as it possibly can, so the glue can stick to it with no oil or grease or dust in between. So to clean the inside of the gear, get a piece of old tissue, or this is actually kitchen paper, kitchen towel roll, twist it into a tight twist. Take some acetone. Again, I'll show you, I'll put a link in the video of where you can get some acetone from on Amazon. Soak the tissue in that and then put it through your gear and literally run it through the center of your gear, just twisting my gear around, cleaning up the inside. You'll see the tissue will turn sort of a grey colour as it cleans out all the muck that's inside the gear. Push that on. Some people use pipe cleaners for this kind of thing. There are other sort of things that I've seen people use, but I just use the tissue. It works all right for me. So I'll probably do that a couple of times. I'll then take a clean bit of tissue, do that again, and clean out the inside of my gear thoroughly. Also, you need to clean the axle off. So again, clean bit of tissue, using the acetone that's already on the tissue here. Give it a wipe. Wipe the gear again, a couple of places on the tissue, just making sure that the gear is, or the axle is nice and clean. Then obviously don't put your fingers on that bit of the axle again, because you don't want any grease from your fingers to get onto the axle. So I'm going to put it in my little jig here, probably just push that in one of the holes there just to hold the axle, so I'm not going to be touching the bit where I'm going to be gluing. So now that I've cleaned up my gear and my axle, it's time to get the gear positioned right on the axle, so that when I cover them both in glue, I can always slide it back on into the right place. So here's my axle. I'm being careful not to touch the bits that I've cleaned up. Slide my gear onto the axle. Now I've already measured before that I needed about 7.5 millimeters for the exposed axle at the end. So I'm going to put that, set that up to 7.5 away like so. Then this is where I'm going to use one of my old hubs. So slide that in there and I can tighten that up on the axle. Just check that I've still got that the right distance. Yes, I have. So tighten that hub up onto the axle like that, and then I know that when I slide my gear on, I can slide it right up to the hub and it's going to be spaced correctly onto the axle. So again, I'm going to do that for all the other gears and axles that I've got ready to glue.